Draft Mechanic is a proud member of Punchboard Media. Pull up a chair at punchboardmedia.com. Draft Mechanic, Episode 77.
On this episode of Draft Mechanic, we discuss recent plays of Carcassonne over Hill and Dale, Alhambra, and Cleopatra and the Society of Architects. We've got a high-gravity review and an on-tap of Vinhos Deluxe, a beer primer on hefeweizens, and in our final round, we asked our Slack channel about pointing out other players' options. So sit back, relax, grab a pint, and enjoy the show.
You've seen the future and it works to take a mile. You're there. All is for the best in the best of our world.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Draft Mechanic. I'm Jake.
And I'm Danielle.
And Draft Mechanic is the podcast about board games and craft beer and anything we can do to tie the two together.
Here at Draft Mechanic, we like our beer like we like our board games.
Appearing initially to be about drinking, but instead much thinking about efficiency.
I mean, I don't generally think about efficiency when I drink my beer. I try to, enjoy it.
The way I look at it is that I'm trying to be as efficient as I can with my beer. I just want to make sure I'm getting, a good representation of a bunch of different things coming in so I can get a wide variety of choices. And then also we're talking about Vinhos today, which is definitely a game about thinking a whole lot.
Certainly.
Yes, we are bringing Vinhos on to review today for our second high-gravity feature. We did Agra back in quarter one. We're going to do Vinhos in this episode and kind of just continue rolling on with some high-gravity stuff in each quarter, hopefully. But hey, if this is your first episode of Draft Mechanic, thank you so much for tuning in. We love getting new listeners. You can come and join us on our Slack channel. We have a Slack that you can come and talk with us at, draftmechanic.net/Slack if you want to join in with that.
That is also where we put up our final round questions, so if you hear the discussion at the end of the episode and you're thinking to yourself, I would like to be part of that discussion or a similar discussion, then that is the place to go.
Of course, we're on the internet at all the usual places. Draftmechanic.net is the website. At DraftMechanic on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are also great options.
We've also got a Board Game Geek Guild. That is guild number 2470. There will be a thread up for this episode and every episode. So if you want to give us a shout out, let us know what you think about what we said, that is another place you can go.
Draft Mechanic is a proud member of Punchboard Media. I highly encourage you to go to punchboardmedia.com and check out all the other great video, written, and audio content creators, especially after this Origins weekend. There's a lot of content up there from people that went to Origins, and they have all sorts of fun stuff to talk about from that.
If you happen to be in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, we'd love for you to come out to one of our game nights. We do a game night on the first Thursday of every month and the third Tuesday of every month. The next one we have coming up is going to be on June 19th. So if you're listening to this the day or the day after it releases, that will be the Tuesday that is of that week. That is going to be at Salud Cerveceria, which we would love for you to come out, drink some delicious beers, have, I think they're still doing food from Sabor down the street, so there will be food to be had, which is very good. They have great big tables for playing great big board games, and we'd love to have a great time with you guys.
And if you've never had a chance to make it to one of our midweek meetups, we do have an exciting bit of news. In August, our typical meetup at Good Road Cider Works actually falls during Gen Con, so obviously we will not be there for that as we are going to Gen Con, but we've worked out a fun Sunday day. We're calling it the Great Big Board Game Day, so on Sunday, August 12th at Good Road Cider Works, we will be there all day playing tons of games. We'll hopefully have some new exciting hotness from Gen Con for you to check out, so if you've always wanted to come to one of those meetups but had not had a chance because it's in the middle of the week, maybe you're coming from out of town, this is a great opportunity, and if you want, there's information on that up on the Facebook page. Just go there, look at Facebook events for Draft Mechanic, Great Big Board Game Day. Yes.
And if you have a family and you're wondering if it would be an appropriate thing for them to go to because it is at a cider brewery, they do have a lot of non-alcoholic beverages available, and it is a really bright, friendly space. If you're worried about bringing kids, I would say don't be.
Okay, so games news. Like we said, it is during Origins weekend we're recording this. We're actually recording Saturday night, and just a little while ago, they announced the winners of the Origins Games Awards. So here's those facts, if you haven't already heard them on the internet everywhere. Unsurprisingly, Game of the Year went to Gloomhaven. Surprisingly, Card Game went to Ex Libris. How do you feel about this?
I mean, it is certainly a very card-heavy game, but there are, I think, some board components, but really they're just locations that could be printed on cards, I suppose. it's a good game, and I'm glad to see it recognized, although I would not have necessarily thought of it as a card game. But
Yeah.
the best family game is actually Azul, which tracks with the fact that it is nominated for the Spiel des Jahres, which is sort of a game that is aimed at a more family audience. So I'm very pleased to see Azul in this position as the best family game for Origins.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that one. We had a lot of fun with Azul, and Azul continues to hit the table pretty much every time we go to a game night. We see somebody playing it somewhere, and I wouldn't be surprised if that continues through. I don't know. I'm still thinking that that's going to be the one that wins the Spiel this year. I don't have a lot of faith in the Mind winning, other than it's a cheap game that is a game. You know, it's easy to play, that's for sure. But I want it to go to Azul because I've really enjoyed Azul, and they'll make me feel validated. Another category I was actually kind of interested to see, there's a category for Best Gaming Accessory of the Year, and this year, The Broken Token won it for their Terraforming Mars insert. I really like that. I didn't realize that Origins had a gaming accessory category. Maybe they just added it, or maybe I just have not paid attention to this in the past.
Probably that one.
But Broken Token is my personal selection for, game inserts, stuff like that, and I've definitely considered this one a few times.
Now, how much do you think that this winning gaming accessory of the year has to do with the fact that everybody complains that it's so necessary to have some kind of, at least, player board setup for Terraforming Mars? That everybody's like, oh, Terraforming Mars needs an insert and it needs board covers so badly.
Yada, yada, right? I mean, realistically, I think that the rest of the insert is quite nice as well, and it does have some neat little, just kind of trinket things, like they replace some of the different trackers on each of the tracks with a different kind of token as well. So it's more than just some game trays and card sleeve or card shelf kind of things. It also has a removable card shoe, so you can stack all the cards for Terraforming Mars up, and then they're not falling all over the place if you've sleeved them.
Who uses a shoe?
And then the other category I thought worthy of mention for the RPG supplement category, Dungeons & Dragons, The Xanathar's Guide to Everything is the winner there. I'm assuming that you've probably looked through this at some point.
I have, actually. I was looking through Dan's copy about 2 weeks ago. And I'm really excited to see this get a win here in this category as well, because it's one of those books that everybody I know that plays Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has seen something in the Xanathar's Guide to Everything that has been at least helpful or interesting to them. So if it's really adding content that can be used for all of the different types of players, that's the kind of thing that's a really cool RPG supplement, and I think it's a really good one. And it's got a really funny goldfish beholder on the cover, too, which is not a reason to win an award, but it's cool if you see it.
Yes. Well, if you were looking for more information on those, obviously they were all posted on their Twitter account, and that's where I got them, but I'm sure that the Origins website has plenty more information on that. But enough about Origins, I would like to talk about Kickstarters, because that's kind of what we do early on in the episode. Are you okay with that?
Sure.
All right, real quick recap of last episode. We talked about Villagers from Sinister Fish Games. This one finished, funded at almost 6,300% of its initial funding goal.
That's too many.
Yeah, pulling in £482,000 with 14,351 backers. The final stretch goal, this is an interesting one. They are going to do a random drawing of all 14,000 backers, and then 4 of those backers are going to get drawn in as cards in the game. I think that's kind of a neat idea. Unsurprisingly, the internet comment section, don't go in comments. Never go in the comments section. It's not a pleasant place to be. The entitlement for some of these 14,000 backers that all assume that they get to be the one picked was kind of silly. I thought this is a really cool stretch goal and a really nice way to cap off a campaign that had added probably way too much stuff in stretch goals to do something that didn't add anything crazy and just had an opportunity to really shine for the backers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. At that point, you're not wanting to add any more content because you're well beyond what you were expecting if you're almost 63,000% of your goal. Oh, I'm sorry.
6,300.
Yeah, sorry.
Only 6,300% of funding.
So to add something that you're only really just adding a piece of art that you would need to create anyway, it's just going to be tailored to make an experience really special for someone and give everybody the chance to possibly be that someone. That's the kind of stretch goal that at that point is probably a wise decision.
I am very interested to watch this one just to see if it delivers anywhere near schedule. I really hope that they do, but that is a lot. They have 10 times more backers than they expected to get. They thought they were going to get like 1,000, maybe 1,500 backers. So this one just took off. So good for Sinister Fish Games. Congratulations to Villagers on funding exceptionally well.
On Tour, which we talked about coming from BoardGameTables.com, actually funded at 524% of their goal. They had $104,758 total dollars and 3,230 backers.
I was one of them. Unsurprisingly, I like a roll and write. I really like the dry erase boards used in a roll and write, and I'm hoping that those dry erase pens that we get are decent enough quality to last for a bunch of games.
You like a music theme too, so I'm very not surprised that you funded this.
And I'm really interested to see also in the Pledge Manager, apparently you can add extra player boards by the one instead of going just straight up to the 12 player count board. So that's a nice little opportunity. Just buy a few extra boards, like if you wanted to have like a 6-player set or something.
It is a little weird that they jumped right from 4 to 12 when they were listing things. So it's good to see them give sort of an intermediate amount of boards.
Yeah, and there is a pre-order link. If you go to that Kickstarter campaign, you can, I guess, still late pledge and or pre-order it for getting that whenever it gets to us. The last one from last episode that we can talk about is Herbaceous Sprouts from Pencil First Games. This is the dice game version of Herbaceous. It's currently at 316% of its funding goal, 64-ish thousand of $20,000 goal, with 1,182 backers. This one ends midnight on Monday, June 18th. That is today as of release. So if you missed that last time and you're still interested, you can rush over to Kickstarter and look at that one. They've upgraded 9 component quality stretch goals so far, which is cool. Again, they only did component quality upgrades on Herbaceous Sprouts, and I really got to commend that, because that means that it's not going to take a whole bunch of extra time or a whole bunch of extra work to balance and set up that game to have all this extra content in it.
So moving on to new Kickstarter projects that we haven't already talked about, I want to start with Creatures and Cupcakes, which comes from Social Sloth Games, which is actually an imprint that's underneath the Grey Fox Games umbrella. You may have heard of Grey Fox Games a couple of times on this show. Well, this is their new imprint that they're going for a more light family weight game. This is currently funding at 154% of its goal, so about $4,600, and it's got 222 backers. This is ending on Monday, June 25th, with an estimated delivery in December of this year. You can back it for $15, which is a great price point. In this game, you are pushing your luck, drawing cupcakes out of a bag to try to bring some monsters to display at the court, and really try to push your luck and get some really fun take that cards that you're going to be able to use so that the other player can't get their monsters to the court before you do. We got a chance to play this at Geekway to the West, and while it might not necessarily have been intended for the group of gamers that were playing the game, it was you and I and Adrian from Mile High Game Guys, and I think Zach from Mile High Game Guys as well. And we were probably not the intended audience, but we were certainly using the Take That in the Take That cards.
Oh, much of that was taken.
But, I mean, if you have kids that are maybe younger elementary school, this is going to be a fun game where they probably won't lean quite as hard into the hindering other players as we did. But for $15, this is a great Kickstarter for families.
Yeah, we had some fun with it for sure at Geekway, and I'm glad to see this one getting funded and, doing pretty good so far. So might go check that out. That is Creatures and Cupcakes. Up next, I'm going to take a look at Fantastic Factories. This is a self-published game from Joseph Z. Chen. It's currently funded at 637% of its goal, about almost $100,000 right now. 2,723 backers. This one ends at 11 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, June 28th, with an estimated delivery of April 2019. You can back this for $29, and it is a simultaneous play, engine-building game with dice allocation. You roll dice, you take actions to generate resources, you use the resources to buy better cards, and you repeat. Primarily, you are rolling dice and allocating those dice. So, this is like another game that's squarely in my wheelhouse. It's advertised as that 45 minutes to an hour thing. It's kind of like another game in the place of the Machikoro space, but attacking and fixing that problem where in Machikoro, 60% of your turns you don't do anything worthwhile at all. One thing I really appreciated about this, and just watching the gameplay videos and looking at reviews of it, is that everybody is kind of doing simultaneous play. You're rolling together, you're allocating your actions together, you're getting your resources at the same time. So you're not beholden to waiting for however many players for the turn to come back around to you. Everybody has their own dice. They're building their own factory and putting their own cards in play. And I just, I'm a sucker for engine building. I think it's a neat system, and from what I've heard from people that have played it, it does definitely deliver a fun and rewarding experience of that engine building.
Awesome.
Yeah, $29. Pretty decent price for that hour-long, what do they call it? The power filler is what we're talking about, or the 1 hour wonder is another one that I've heard.
Is that a thing that people say?
Some people have said these things. I cannot confirm or deny who they are. That is Fantastic Factories. You got, I guess, about a week and change to go back that if you want to.
Finally, we wanted to talk about Coldwater Crown The Sea expansion.
Woo!
This is coming from Bellwether Games. It launches on Wednesday, June 20th, so if you are listening to this day of, it's not up yet, but come check it out at the end of the week. This is going to be a $24 expansion that you can back, but there is also a pledge level to get the base game and the expansion for $68, which is a little less than MSRP if you're looking for that.
Boats.
The Sea expansion adds a fourth location that you can send your workers to when you are playing. There, you already had the shore, the lake, and the river. Well, now you've got the sea. And the sea is a location that you go to and you can only interact with the fish that are at that location when you're there. But when you are pulling in fish, it is no longer only about getting different species. You're getting points based on the total weight of fish that you've caught. So it is really advantageous to get a bunch of fish from that location while you're out there and then come back from there. But it also allows you to really get a better turn if there's nothing that's set up in the right position, because in Coldwater Crown, you are placing out a token, which is either a 1 or a 2, and you're pulling back a token. If you've played Raiders of the North Sea, this is a similar mechanic to that. And depending on what is left on the board when you start your turn, it may or may not be in an ideal situation for what you had planned to do. Well, now the sea gives you an option. If the board is not in a state that is ideal for your turn, you can instead take a port action to go to sea, and that is going to give you a new set of fish to interact with. It also adds a new master angler fish, which is a place where you can use spent tokens that are your bait. And this one allows you to put any kind of bait on there so that you are using everything that you're pulling off your board as opposed to only specific colors. I think this really adds a lot to what you can do with Coldwater Crown, and I'm excited for it. Plus, it has really cool adjustable boats.
Yeah, we had an opportunity to play a few games with the Sea expansion, thankfully, and just really impressed with how well it meshes into the current game of Coldwater Crown. It doesn't overpower Coldwater Crown's base game, and it doesn't, completely change what you need to focus on. It just gives you another option, another place that you can go. Like Danielle said, if you really want to take different advantage of what's currently on the board, you can send your boat out to sea by going to the port and take an action to send your boat out to sea there. And then you're still using the same tokens on the main board to manipulate your bait, but dealing with the fish that are available on the sea board. And I really like that. It doesn't complicated, it just adds to it. It allows you another option, another way to interact with what you already have. And it still really focuses in on that great casting worker placement mechanic that I really feel like is super thematic in a game about fishing, where you're placing a worker, you're pulling a worker back out. It feels like casting. And from talking with Brian Surrey, the designer, that's kind of where the game ended up getting its theme, because he really was working with that mechanic and said, well, this feels like casting. This makes perfect sense. And I really like the Sea. I like Coldwater Crown a lot. This one is a no-brainer for me, and I'm really glad that we had an opportunity to play a few games of it so we can tell you all about it.
So once again, that is a $24 pledge to get this expansion, $68 if you need the base game, and it will be launching on the 20th. Coldwater Crown The Sea. I
will be there, waiting, hovering over the Kickstarter button to get the Sea.
Probably unnecessary.
But quickly thereafter. All right, well, that is it for Kickstarters. It's time for us to take a quick break. We will move on and talk about some games we've been playing. Want a second opinion on some of the games we talked about on this episode? Check out some other great content creators at punchboardmedia.com.
In this episode Carcassonne review, we're going to be talking about Carcassonne Over Hill and Dale. If you have missed the past 2 episodes, we have been doing a Carcassonne episode, and we are going to continue that for at least one more episode after this one. So if you don't get your Carcassonne fix anywhere else, this is the place to get it.
Mm-hmm. So, we have Carcassonne Over Hill and Dale, 2015 release from Z-Man Games. Plays 2 to 5 players in 35 minutes. It is, unsurprisingly, designed by Klaus Jürgenwerder. It is art by Doris Matthias. This is a tile-laying, sheep and barns, and walking game.
In Carcassonne Over Hill and Dale, you are, unsurprisingly, drawing tiles from a pile of face-down tiles and placing them out into a tableau of lush, hilly
Lots of tiles.
hilly farmland
Tile
with
land.
lots of tiles.
Farm tiles.
In Carcassonne Over Hill and Dale, you've got a couple of different features that will stray from your traditional Carcassonne. Just in case you have not played Carcassonne at all, you're going to be drawing these tiles which have features on them. You're attempting to complete features and score them to get points. Each of the types of features scores differently, and when you run out of tiles, the game is over and whoever has the most points wins. That is your standard Carcassonne rules set.
Tiles.
In Over Hill and Dale, you have 3 types of features, or scoring rather, with which you are concerned. You have gardens of vegetables, which you are going to place your meeple in, and when a garden is completed, you are going to receive tokens for every icon of vegetables that are within that garden. You are going to be collecting these in a set collection mechanic where you're trying to get sets of 5 different vegetable icons. There is a scarecrow which can be used to fill in any missing sets that you don't necessarily have all 5 for. So say you have 3 different vegetables and 2 scarecrows, you could put those scarecrows into a set and they would fill in and you'd have a set of 5 and you'd be able to score that at the end of the game. Those are going to be kept secret until the end of the game when you'll get that additional scoring. Next you have the roads. In regular Carcassonne, you would only score a road when it completed, and then you would get the number of points equal to the number of tiles in that road. In Over Hill and Dale, they've added a walking mechanic, where when you extend a road that you've already got your meeple on, but don't complete it, you can walk your meeple from its current position to one end of the road. That allows you to continuously get points from a road that you are extending but haven't necessarily completed yet. When you do complete the road, you will remove your meeple and score it in the normal fashion where you just get the number of points for the total road. The third type of scoring that Over Hill and Dale has is a permanent placement of a meeple, which is similar to the farmers in the original Carcassonne. You place them out on the tableau and they stay there till the end of the game. Unlike the farmers in regular Carcassonne, though, you are not concerned with the entire board when you place them out. You're only concerned with the 9 tiles surrounding and including that meeple that you've placed. And you're going to get points at the end of the game for every animal depicted on the tiles that are in that 9-tile grid. There are animals drawn on a good number of the tiles, and you're going to want to place them to create features around where you've laid down your farmer so that you can get the most points at the end. Once you have laid those 9 tiles, you don't really need to concern yourself with how you're going to score on that meeple any longer, and nobody can ever take away those animal points from you. There's no way to move animals away from your meeple. I have talked about only having one type of permanent meeple, and that's really good in this game because you only have 4 meeples in this game. We had talked about this last episode when we talked about Discovery having a really limited number of meeples. And in regular Carcassonne, I think you have 7 meeples to start with. But in this game, you have a much more restricted meeple pool. So it's important that you have that perpetual scoring from the road and that you are able to really make a useful point engine out of scoring a bunch of icons in your gardens and repeatedly walking back and forth across the road. It is an interesting game that makes you think about where you're going to place your meeples, but also not feel like you've left stuff there that you may not get any kind of return on at the end of the game. I really enjoy this variant, and I'm hoping that you also do, because then we can play it a whole bunch again.
No, I dig it. Over Hill and Dale was nice. It definitely this is the most recent of the Carcassonne spinoffs, by the way, coming out in 2015. It definitely takes a lot of cues from older ones. Obviously, with when you complete a particular field in this one, we think about cities in classic Carcassonne. It takes a cue from the traders and builders of the set collection of the tiles, and I do really like having that. And I feel like it's a simplified version of that in that you just get a point for every tile and you get a point for a set rather than having to worry about majorities in each of the different kinds of goods like you do in Traders and Builders. I think that the road scoring is really interesting and it makes roads actually like exciting in a way. So I remember so often in classic Carcassonne games, you just always have a meeple that's on a road, and the road just is where you discard your road tiles that you're not using for cities. Since a road will score 1 point per space, whether it's completed or not at the end of the game, it really it didn't matter to close off roads. But now you have an incentive to actually add on to the roads and have your meeple continually take longer and longer walks. So I definitely think that's a nice little addition and makes that more interesting. It's interesting also to see so many of these spin-offs focus on the restricted meeple pool. Like you said, in base Carcassonne, you have 6 or 7 standard meeples, whatever it is. But even as you go on with base Carcassonne, you continue to get the builder meeple, you get a pig meeple, you get a stable at some point, all these other different tons and tons and tons and tons of different pieces you have to play with. It's interesting to see these spin-offs focus on smaller and more restrictive sets of workers for each player.
I feel like so far all of the spin-offs that we've had a chance to play, and I hope to see this continue, have focused on one aspect of the big expanded many expansions Carcassonne base game, and I hope to see what new things that they can pull out of it. In Over Hill and Dale, you've got, certainly like you said before, that traders and builders mechanic that we've seen in the original game, but they've made something that is its own standalone version of that. I think Discovery is more of building on the farmer mechanic where you can always continue to add to what you've already placed. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting just to see what they can do when they create a game that is built around something that already exists and sort of refining it and maybe pulling it back and making it a little bit simpler and a little bit more elegant. And I think that's what this version really is for the Traders and Builders expansion.
Yeah, this is definitely a good, worthwhile standalone if you want to have another version of, or if you want to have a version of Carcassonne that has a little bit more than your base box kind of stuff. So yeah, Over Hill and Dale's been pretty good.
I do think that in really streamlining this game, they have made it a little bit more simple. It doesn't feel as complicated as adding in expansions to Carcassonne can be, probably because we never really add just one. But this game is really simple to explain and to deal with, and especially since it doesn't have that farmer thing where you really perpetually need to be looking at everything that everybody else is putting down to make sure that they're not coming in to take control of a field that you're trying to take control of. Because your worker that you're leaving till the end of the game is really just all about what you can put around it and making sure that somebody else doesn't put a tile with no animals around that. It's really a lot easier to teach and to worry about and not have to think about, oh, I'm going to get sniped at the end of the game when somebody suddenly places that last tile and it takes my field from me. It feels like a really nice, fluffy version of Carcassonne. Okay.
So what's your current Carcassonne ranking of the ones we've featured so far?
This one might be my favorite, honestly. Okay. I like the Traders and Builders expansion for original Carcassonne. It's my favorite of those expansions. So I like to see a game that is built around that. The art is adorable. It's got such little cute chickens and pigses and cows and horses. I love the art of it. And I like the set collection. I think this is probably my favorite. I know you really like the city that we talked about a couple of episodes ago. But this would probably be, for me, the top one.
Okay. I would go city is my favorite so far. I love the long-term planning in the city where you're laying out all of your special buildings. But I think this might be my second favorite of these as well. I liked Discovery well enough. It was good to play, and I'm glad that we had it to play it. And it did kind of fuel us on this Carcassonne binge in a way. But, yeah, I mean, city for sure. And this is up there.
That is Carcassonne Over Hill and Dale. Next up, we got to play Alhambra, which is a 2003 game from Queen Games. We actually got to play the 2009 Big Box Edition, and it plays 2 to 6 players in about 60 minutes. The designer is Dirk Henn, and the artist is Hans-Jörg Brem, Joe Hartwig, and Christoph Tisch. This is a game of city building, hand management, and way overspending to accidentally realize that you can't place because of the walls.
So in a game of Alhambra, and I'll just go with the base game to begin here, you are building a palace in front of you. The palace is made up of these tiles.
Tiles!
I know, square tiles. Who would have thought? And you are going to be purchasing them out of this central market. The market is split up into 4 different areas, and each of the 4 areas will be assigned a specific type of currency. And you're going to have cards in your hand that are of the 4 different types of currency, and you're going to, on your turn, probably be spending cards out of your hand to purchase one of those tiles. The tiles have the value on them themselves, in addition to whatever specific currency that slot relates to. But the interesting thing here is that you cannot get change for the cards that you play, so you're probably going to overspend a good bit to get that perfect tile at the right time. If, however, you do have the right cards in your hand and you're able to pay exact change, well, lucky you, because you get to then take a second action, and you only get to take 1 action a turn, so that's basically a second turn. If you can't buy anything, you're just going to draw money cards out of a money row, basically. And once you get the tiles into your particular palace setup, you're going to be laying them out next to each other because tiles. And some of the tiles will have walls on them, and you have to always, when you place a tile, have a path back to your center square. There will be a few scoring rounds throughout the game, generally 3, maybe inexplicably only 2, but you're going to be scoring based on majorities of whatever kind of tiles you've been placing into your particular palace. If you have the most of the red, you will get the points for that particular scoring round, and then as you go into the second and third scoring rounds, you'll have first, second, and then first, second, and third places of those be getting increasingly higher amounts of points. By the end of the game, if you have amassed the most points, what a surprise, you have won. We also played with a few additional modules that added some fun cards. There were some different character personalities that when one of those came up into the money row, the gameplay would just stop and we would do an auction. There was also an opportunity to basically interrupt another player's turn or before or after another player's turn if there was something up that you could spend exact change for to immediately get that tile. But there's a whole ton of little tiny modules that you can plug in the big box of Alhambra. And we threw a few of those in because why not spice it up a little bit?
Why not?
This is actually my first time playing Alhambra. It's interesting when you get one of these older, quote-unquote, classic games, and you just kind of didn't really get around to them because of whenever we came into the hobby. And this is one that came up because somebody had it at the game night, and we said, well, why the heck not? Let's play this game. And it's a game, and it definitely lays tiles. I don't know. I mean, it's good. Like, it's a good, solid design. The design is consistent. I wasn't super excited by it, and I think a lot of that could just be because tile placement and auctioning has gone so far in the last, 15 years since Alhambra came out. But I can definitely see a lot of strength in the original design, and I understand why it's so respected and why people have played it for so long that it is still 15 years later coming out at random game nights.
Yeah, I agree. This is definitely an interesting game to see where it has the ideas that are in it have developed too. There were some frustrations in playing this game, for me at least. I know the wall placement was particularly annoying because of the way that you had to have all of the walls connecting so that you had a clear path back to the center. You also got points for having a long wall, but if that long wall went through the middle of your city, it for some reason didn't count. Even though it was a very long wall. It has to be
wall.
On the outside. Yeah. We were also playing with the gate expansion that allowed you to put a gate in a wall, and I think that helped a lot because it did allow you to place some tiles that otherwise you might have had to put in your reserve area. But there were also points in the game where there was a high-value tile on one of the currencies, and those cards just weren't coming out. And that tile sat there for a good 3, 4, 5 rounds, which is a little bit frustrating because you want to keep seeing different types of tiles and keep moving on so that you can get different majorities. But it was a fun game. I enjoyed it. I would certainly play it again. I know in that big box there's a ton of stuff that we haven't even seen yet. So this is sort of akin to, we were just talking about Carcassonne. Base Alhambra is kind of like base Carcassonne. You start out with a fairly simple premise, and then you can add a whole ton of stuff to make it way more complicated. But at its core, it's a fairly simple game. comparing those two, I would certainly rather play Carcassonne. I feel like it's a little bit of a more elegant game. But Alhambra is certainly a game that if you have an opportunity to play and you haven't played it, you should give it a shot.
Yeah. Honestly, my biggest frustration with Alhambra is just the way that the money cards come out, because, like you said, if you have a very high value tile and nobody is collecting the correct currencies to buy it, it just sits there and it kind of chokes it up. So hopefully there's some other expansions that allow a little bit more fun and a little bit more variability in the market there, so you could have some more fun. But I'll play Alhambra again. Absolutely. I really don't see a reason not to. It's held up this long. Who am I to say no?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily going to seek it out, but I'll definitely play it again if somebody wants to.
All right, that is Alhambra. So finally, in our inexplicably vintage section of the podcast today, we have Cleopatra and the Society of Architects. This is a 2006 release from Days of Wonder that plays 3 to 6 players in about 60 minutes. It is designed by the power duo of Bruno Catala and Ludovic Malblanc, with art by Cyril Dejean and Julien Delval. This is a game of card drafting, building, hand management, corruption, and mostly Egypt.
In Cleopatra and the Society of Architects, you are trying to build up Cleopatra's temple. And it's got a bunch of parts. It's got a handful of sphinxes, it's got a couple of obelisks, it's got some door jambs and some columns that go around the outside, and a very fancy roof, which is made up of mosaics and statues. It's a cool place, this Cleopatra's temple. Mm-hmm. What you're going to be doing on your turn is either building one of those items, all of which require a certain combination of building materials, or you're going to be drawing cards into your hand with which to build one of those things on future turns. Problem is that not all of the building materials are equal. There are less efficient building materials, which are going to offer you one of whatever specific material they are, maybe wood or stone or marble or lapis. And there are corrupt versions that are given to you by the crocodile god's followers, which will give you 2 of those things, but they're also going to force you to take a corruption token, which you are going to secretly place into your own little personal pyramid for counting at the end of the game, because the person who is the most corrupt at the end of the game is going to be fed to Cleopatra's pet crocodile because they were too corrupt.
Question. Are we going to unpack the crocodile god thing?
No.
Okay.
I will tell you that I tried to put every other piece in the game into my pyramid, and the person who owned the game and was teaching me was sort of disappointed in me, I think. So like I said, you're going to be taking a pile of cards to get the resources with which to build your sphinxes and obelisks and such. Now, at the beginning of the game, the deck is split in half, and half of the deck is turned face up. Then the deck is reshuffled back together, so half of your cards are face up and half of your cards are face down. On your turn, if you take a pile of cards, you, I believe, have 3 piles of cards to choose from, you are then going to have to take a card from the top of the draw deck and place it onto one of the 3 different piles that are available. You get to choose which pile they go on until you get to the last one, at which point the card just has to go onto the pile that you haven't added to already. But you're going to see what some of them are as they're being drawn, and some of them will be hidden, and nobody will know what they are until they take that pile. This is going to be made up of, like I said, the legit building goods and also the corrupt building goods, and some corrupt characters that are going to give you special abilities, but are also going to add more corruption tokens to your pyramid and increase the chance that you get fed to the crocodile at the end of the game. The game is going to end when 5 of the 6 portions of Cleopatra's temple have been completely built. So that is either the Sphinx, obelisk, door jamb, walls, mosaic, or throne. You can not finish one of them. It'll probably be mosaics, I'm not going to lie. Or when all 5 of those 6 are completed, you are going to end the game and you're going to count up how much corruption each player has. And if you don't have the most corruption, then you're going to count up the number of points you've earned from what you constructed, and you will be the winner if you have the most points. I think another neat part of this game is that you are going to be rolling dice every time you you build a portion of the temple, and if all of the dice end up with the Ankh sign face up, there is going to be an auction to give a tithing, essentially, to the great priest. And everybody is going to be bidding with their points that you need to have at the end of the game. Whoever has the most is going to lose corruption, and very quickly after most, you are going to start taking corruption all the way down to the last player in the bid is going to, I think, take 3 or 4 corruption. So if you're not giving up enough victory points, you may be taking some corruption and getting eaten, and it won't matter how many points you have at the end of the game because you don't get to score. That is Cleopatra and the Society of Architects in a nutshell.
Yeah. The deck mechanic in Cleopatra, where you take this deck of cards, turn half of it upside down, shuffle it, and use that for your deck. I love this mechanic. I do not understand why I have not seen this pretty much in any other game. The only thing I could really think of is a game like Stockpile, in which you are kind of putting cards out into these different stock portfolios, and as, you know, insider trading, you have an idea of what cards you've placed face down, but the thought that there are cards that are face down, cards that are face up, and nobody knows what the face down ones are going to be until you draw is just freaking stellar. I love this mechanic, and I do not understand why other games aren't taking advantage of this. I actually, from playing this game and thinking about it, like, I want to try doing that in Ethnos to completely replace the way that you top deck and draw cards out of the game in Ethnos. I don't know. That's a crazy idea and not at all what we're talking about here, but I love this deck mechanic. It's so freaking cool.
I think the really other ingenious part about this game is just the way it is constructed. You are literally going to take the box and put it on the table, and the temple gets built around the box lid. So you have this base that you've placed, and then you're placing all these plastic pieces around it to create the walls. You'll place the door on the front of the box. There are a row of sphinxes on either side of the path that is tracking how far along the game you are based on how many different types of structures you've completed. And by the end of it, when you look at this thing, it doesn't look like a box. It looks like some kind of model that you've created of a temple, and it really is striking on the table.
Yeah. We'll have pictures of this up on the website under our show notes as well, so you can take a look at it. It is kind of frustrating that this is a game that you cannot find anymore. I was really excited to hear that our friend Bert had a copy of it, because it's an opportunity to play a game like this. And I'm honestly kind of surprised that this one has not come back around again. I can only assume it's some kind of licensing issue, because the production is excellent, and I know that this game would sell like hotcakes if it came out again today.
Licensing on Cleopatra?
Yeah, you know, the proprietary Sphinx.
I'm kind of wondering if it's a production cost issue, because you do have all these, essentially, I think they're molded pieces of plastic that you're creating for the game. I'm wondering if it's just, it would be too costly to create.
Could be. There are a few things I didn't like about it. I wasn't too keen on the way that you had to have the specific sets of things you had to have to build. For example, pretty much everything requires you to have artisan cards, and I just had a period where I simply was not able to get artisan cards for, I don't know, a good 20% of the game, and it just sucked that way. But it's just what you get with any kind of random deck shuffling. I would like to see some kind of more variance in what each of the thing requires, but I think that also could be due to the fact that they want to kind of encourage you to use cards that are corrupted, or to do things that will give you more corruption tokens, so that you're constantly escalating that.
I get that, but one of the things that was a corrupt card that you could use gave you any resource in the game except for artisan cards. So it doesn't even encourage you to use that type of card, because that doesn't give you an artisan. I also had points in the game where I had a combination of cards, and I looked down and there was only one thing that I could make with them, really, unless I wanted to draw a whole bunch more cards, at which point it didn't really feel like I was even working towards something. It was just like, oh, these could eventually become that, but we're nowhere near it. And I did sort of feel like there were a lot more combinations that were made out of certain resources, and I didn't necessarily feel that there were that many more of those resources in the deck.
I guess I just would really like to see a second edition of this game, you know, continuing the good, strong component quality that Days of Wonder has always been known for, and just get a few modernizations and rule tweaks, you know, different ways for you to manipulate your cards so that you can get a better set of stuff, so you can end up doing more things during the game. But, like, I just also want games to take advantage of that draw deck mechanic, because I think it's really smart. I don't understand why nobody's doing this. I'm sure somebody out there listening is going to be able to tell me other games that are using it. By all means, tweet us at Draft Mechanic on Twitter, or go to the Facebook page, anything. Please let me know where I can do this card draw mechanic.
Yeah, I agree with you that the card draw mechanic is really cool, and I will say the game looks really pretty. I am not in a huge rush to play it again, but it certainly has some interesting ideas that could be used in, like you said, in other games, and I'd love to see them in other games.
Yeah.
This one is not available, so I guess it's probably for the best that we're saying it's not like a game you need to play right now because it is so hard to find. But if you do see it and this sounds like something you're interested in, check it out.
Yeah, I think it's worth a play. Cleopatra and the Society of Architects. All right, well, that wraps up our recent plays, and it is time for us to take the break and come back with a heavy game. It's Vinhos. As a Viking leader, I'm used to coming into contact with strange new civilizations, usually right before I raid and pillage the heck out of them, and I'm all about collecting the right tools to overpower and control my adversaries. I like an axe.
Well, that's not exactly what's going on here, Gunnar. In Multi-Universum, you are a member of a team of scientists that was trying to create a time machine, but accidentally opened dozens of portals to new dimensions. That would be all well and good, but there are monsters coming through from the other sides, and you need to close as many portals as you can and fast.
Like I said, lady, strange new civilizations, axe to the head.
I suppose. Multi-Universum uses a system where, depending on which of your machine's transmitters you're standing at, your cards will provide a different combination of basic actions. In addition, each transmitter has a different open portal, so tools that are perfect for Portal 3 may not work at Portal 5.
Spears worked better when I invaded the Faroe Islands.
Every time you close a portal, you get a glimpse into another world, so as a scientist, you'll get rewarded for getting a look at a diverse set of worlds, or several looks into a specific world. And don't forget, these resources aren't free, so efficiency is important too. Check out Multi-Universum at greyfoxgames.com or at your game store of choice.
Grey Fox Games, quality games, cleverly crafted.
Our high gravity review this week is of Vinhos Deluxe. This is particularly focused on the 2016 special vintage version of Vinhos, but we did get a chance to play the 2010 version that is included in the Deluxe as well. So we do have a little bit of comparison that we'll talk about at the beginning, but most of this review is going to be focused on the 2016 version. This game came out in 2016 from Eagle Gryphon Games and plays 2 to 4 players in 90 to 180 minutes. It has a BGG weight of 4.09, so it is certainly a high-gravity review. The designer is Vital Lacerda, and the artist is Ian O'Toole. Before we get any farther into this, I do want to say that this was a review copy from Eagle Gryphon Games, so if you think that colors our review, know it ahead of time. This is a big old economic game with industrial production, and you'd think it's about winemaking, but it's really about the business of winemaking.
In a game of Vinhos, you will be establishing vineyards in a bunch of different regions in Portugal, and you will be building those vineyards onto your own personal player board as well, and supplementing them with additional wineries and special staff to produce better and higher quality wines. As you get better at producing more and higher quality wines, you're going to then be taking actions to sell those wines for straight money so you can continue to operate and do things in the game. You can export them to far-off international accounts to get end-game victory points as well as some victory points right away. And you're also going to be using those wines for a wine fair that happens 3 times throughout the game as well. This wine fair allows you to send off one of your best wines to be judged by several different magnates in the wine industry, and also compete for straight points on a second area, which will score you a whole bunch of big points after each of these wine fairs. The game will take place over 6 rounds, or years, and you're considered to be going through a year of winemaking. In each year, you're going to be taking 2 actions, and then doing a maintenance phase, and then have a period where you produce wine for that year. At the end of the 3rd, 5th, and 6th years, you're also going to have the wine fair I just talked about, in which you're going to be submitting one of your best wines to compete on its own personal track that we'll talk about as we go on. There's also a 13th action that takes place after the final wine fair. It's just kind of like a last option to do a few, one final action of sending some wine out or getting some more money, something like that will hopefully set you up best for the endgame scoring. In each of the 6 years of the game, you're going to be taking actions by moving a worker meeple around this 3x3 square in the center of the board. The 3x3 square is the different actions that you can take. For example, purchasing vineyards or adding on wineries or buying additional workers for your tiles, or maybe exporting or selling wine. And depending on where you are on this particular 3x3 grid, you might have to spend additional money to either move an extra space. You get 1 space movement for free, or you will have to pay additional money to other players on the tile you want to go to, or, interestingly enough, the round track marker itself works across the different spaces on that 3x3 grid as well. So if you move on to that particular tile where the round marker currently is, you're going to have to spend an additional $1 on that one.
Taxes.
Now, with only a total of 13 actions really across the entire game, you're going to have to be very efficient, but you also need to acquire these additional magnate tiles that you will be able to get after each of the wine fairs that will allow you to take a free action. And these free actions might replicate some of the action spaces on the board, or they might give you a resource such as, getting some money or getting an extra points at the wine fair. So you're working on getting these additional tiles that you can use once between each wine fair to supplement the things you're already trying to do. At the end of each year, you're also going to do a wine production phase, which is honestly, in my personal opinion, the most exciting and interesting part of the game, as you are using the different features of each of your estates, which is the initial vineyard plus any wineries or workers and oenologists that you have in a particular estate to produce wine. You're going to add up the values of all of those different tiles, and you're going to produce a wine tile that will go onto your personal player board. And as you get better stuff in the game, you're going to be able to add cellars on as well. That will allow you more time for your wine to age and also increase its value as it sits in your cellar longer. If you've done a really good job, then you're going to maybe produce 3 or 4 different wines, one for each of the estates, if you've amassed a whole bunch of different vineyards in different regions. All of this is also affected by a weather tile that is flipped up at the beginning of the year. It'll modify your total wine production value in a particular estate anywhere from -2 to +2. And if for some reason you didn't have, after that weather modification, you're at a 0, that estate's not going to produce any wine at all. So you're constantly having to be aware of the weather condition that will be affecting your end of year production so that you do get wine. Because if you don't have wine, you can't really do a whole lot in a game about winemaking and the strategic business therein.
Can't argue with that.
The weather tile will also dictate what the 3 magnates at the end of the wine fair are looking for, depending on if they want a white or a red wine, or if they want a wine of a specific quality or higher, or maybe even a wine that came from a specific region. And depending on what you satisfy in the wine fair, you're going to get additional tokens that allow you to take more actions in the export and the sale zone, and also grab some very lucrative endgame scoring tiles. I think that's pretty good surface level overview for what we need to talk about here. Obviously, this game has a lot more going into it as the different pieces interact in interesting ways, and you have opportunities to manipulate your wines and all of your other tiles in a whole bunch of ways, but I don't want to bore you right now, because I am just really interested to talk about Vinhos. So, starting off as we usually do, I want to just talk briefly about the components, the presentation, and the rulebook. This is one of Eagle Griffin's big box games. It's a very, large box. It's got a ton of stuff in the box. And
Dense box.
It has a really great art update by Ian O'Toole. There's an original version of Vinhos that came out in 2010, obviously, and this is, I don't know who the artist was, I think it was published by What's Your Game, and Eagle Griffin got the rights to this and gave it the full deluxe treatment here. What do you think about the way that Vinhos looks when it's out on the table?
I think it looks really nice. It has a sort of muted color palette that is not bland looking. It's not, just your basic browns or tans and grays. It does have pinks and blues and greens and yellows, and the color palette is really nice, but it is not glaringly bright colors. It's a nice sort of sedate color palette. I know I was looking on BGG at some of the photos of the original edition board, and I looked at it and I was like, oh dear, what is that? It's certainly a great upgrade in terms of the art quality. I think it's beautiful, like I think a lot of Ian O'Toole's artwork is. It is just really enjoyable to look at, even though it is a lot to look at.
Yeah, and I've looked a lot at, obviously, this one as we've been playing it, but also Lisboa and The Gallerist, kind of like the trilogy of Ian O'Toole art, Vital Lacerda, big box Eagle Griffin games. They all have a very consistent aesthetic to them. They look clean, while still having a ton of information on the board. And now, we actually learned this game back at Geekway to the West from Adrian from the Mile High Game Guys. He took us through a tour of the 2010 rule set using the current, 2016 Deluxe Edition components. And even in the middle of that, super noisy, very busy game hall there, the board was clear enough that it was very easy for us to stay focused on how the game was working, even as all that noise and stuff was going on.
I will say that some of the iconography is not as clear as it perhaps could have been, but there is a very thorough glossary which gives you all of the iconography on all of the different magnate tiles and wine experts. But I do feel like there were a couple of times where we pulled a wine expert up and we're like, what does that one do? But it is, I mean, trying to simplify down what a lot of these different options are, I can see why there might be trouble creating iconography. It is at least cleanly displayed in a way that you can tell, okay, this is that one, and I can go and look it up and find out what that does.
And that's the other thing I really wanted to talk about in the production here. The rulebook set, and I really kind of have to say set of rule components in this one, is really just exceptionally good. In addition to having a standalone rulebook for 2010, a standalone rulebook for 2016. There is also a reference and setup booklet that's about the same size as, either of the rulebooks that gives you clear setup instructions for both versions of the game, plus a very clear reference for all of the different tiles and such. In addition to that, everybody gets a reference booklet that has the reference for actions and turn order and all that stuff for both versions of the game. And then there's also some Kickstarter stuff that we had, and each part of that came with its own rules card that was clear and, explained all this stuff that we didn't actually even get around to playing with yet because there's so much in the base game. It's just really exceptional set of instructional equipment for this game. I really appreciated it.
One, little tiny nitpicky thing, the cards that you get to give you sort of I don't want to say that it's a player aid because it's more than a player aid. It's
the player reference card.
Yeah, it's a player reference card. It is, when you get it, it is folded in the middle. And the way that you would think that it would work is you'd lay it out so that everything you could see on either one side or the other side references the same version. Really, when you get them, I would suggest cutting them in half because it's the front card and the back of the front card and then the inside second card and the back of that card. So really when you lay it out on the table, if you leave them connected, you're seeing rules for two different games. Mm-hmm. So it's obviously a very nitpicky thing because all the information is there. You just need to know where to look. But it would be very easy for somebody to take that card and lay it out open thinking that they're looking at one set of rules when they're actually looking at two sets. So be mindful of that if you do get these cards.
Okay, I see where you're going with that. Another thing to talk about, how did you feel about the learning curve of this game? When did you feel like you were comfortable with it?
I want to say after a full game, I understood the way that things needed to work. During that first game, obviously, anytime you play a game this heavy, the first game is going to be a learning game. And even after having played the 2010 version, the absolute first game we played of this game, the first game of the 2016 game still felt a little bit like I was figuring out the way to make things work. So I would say that your second game of the version that you're playing will feel comfortable to you.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And honestly, I'm glad that we switched to focusing on the 2016 edition because I feel like some of the complexity of the 2010 edition would have made it a thing where maybe it would take 4 or 5 games to really get a feel for how some of that additional stuff works. And we'll talk about that more in the gameplay. But I definitely, during game 2, I started finding myself making moves that were significantly more efficient than the first time I played. Just, using my motion around the grid effectively, using my side actions and wine expert tiles effectively. I was really starting to make some cool, interesting combos and some cool kind of tied together actions there in that game too. Do you feel like you had a point where you leveled up in the understanding of the game? Did the latter games feel like you were making stronger, more efficient moves significantly over the first game or two you played?
I honestly felt like once I understood what I was supposed to do, I don't feel like there was a second level up point. I feel like there are small changes that you can make to do certain things better, but I never felt like I know when we talked about Agra in the beginning of this year, there was a moment where the light bulb came on and I was like, oh shoot, this is all the stuff I need to be doing. In this game, it was more okay, I understand what I'm supposed to be doing and I'm doing it at a basic level. And then I can do this to make that a little bit better. And I can do this to make that a little bit better. Maybe I need to arrange my staff in this way to take best advantage of this type of weather card. And I felt like it was more small incremental changes that I was making.
Yeah, okay. I would agree with that. I definitely felt like over the last 2 games that we played, I was making more effective use of the magnate tiles, for example. I was choosing ones that would be the most efficient for me to have, because there's some on there that seem like they're going to be super powerful, but then you realize you're going to use them a maximum of 3 times during the game, and you might have taken one early on that to really be powerful, you need to use it 4 or 5 times that you'd never get around to. And I found myself taking the action tiles that would be a good leg up rather than a good super powerful action kind of thing.
I think the other thing that makes this game feel like you know more what you're doing is just becoming familiar with some of those end game scoring tiles and with the wine expert tiles, particularly if you are playing only with the basic wine expert tiles, which we've been playing, I think, the last 2 or 3 games with the advanced wine expert tiles.
Yeah.
But even the end game scoring tokens, to know what your options are allows you to play better. For example, there are endgame scoring tiles that give you 1 point for a specific item for each of your wineries. And then there are endgame scoring tiles that will give you 2 points for each of your wineries. And if you don't know that there is a second endgame scoring tile, you may be much more likely to take that first one and score fewer points, and then everything gets restocked and somebody else can take the one that's worth more points. Whereas if you know it's there, you can see that, oh, this is the best I'm going to get for that, or I should wait and maybe save the barrel to activate one that's more valuable to me. It also lets you know what you can actually score. Like, there is a tile, if you can get it, that will give you points at the end of the game for every wine that you have left on your board, which is really useful if you are going to combine it with the points that you're going to get at the end of the game for the value of your wine, which you'll get points for that as well. If you have a bunch of wine left, that's something that you're really going to be aided by knowing is there and planning to have.
So I feel like we're already starting to move into the gameplay discussion here. So I just want to tie it in. I really feel like Vinhos is a game about efficiency. You have 6 rounds, you have 13 realistically total actions, and in 13 actions you have to get a lot done. There is so much that you need to do throughout this game to set yourself up for the best possible wine productions, so that at the end of that round 3, 5, and 6, when you go into the wine fair, you have to be producing the best possible wine if you want to stay ahead on that track. And I think that it's pretty clear that if you neglect the wine fair entirely, you're going to have a hard time getting a good score in this game. There's a lot of points to be had over in that area, and especially since everybody is scoring in some way, if you're not staying competitive on that track and you fall behind, you're staying pretty far behind the whole time.
Yeah, I don't know if we mentioned this, but the wine fair tracking does not reset between wine fairs. So if you have a round where you just sort of neglect the wine fair entirely, you're locked into getting points another way, unless you can make some amazing wine that realistically, unless the weather cooperates with you and you have done some major construction on your estates, you're not going to be able to increase the value of your wines hugely, especially between the second and third wine fairs where you only have 2 actions. If you get behind on that wine fair track, you need to focus on getting points somewhere else.
And a lot of them.
At the same time, while efficiency is so key to this game, I don't ever remember in this game feeling just absolutely lost because I couldn't get anything done. I always felt like there was a pressure to do things in an efficient manner, but not so much so that I couldn't get done what I needed to get done as long as I was paying attention to doing them in the most reasonable manner.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like the way that the action selection block is set up is very conducive to kind of setting you on a specific path. You know, you have in the very center, you have the pass and issue a press release space. And then around the outside, you have buying vineyards, buying wineries, buying cellars, buying workers, getting wine experts, and then those 2 actions of exporting and selling. You're kind of generally able to do anything you need to. It might cost you that $1 extra to move 1 extra space, but for the most part, I find myself kind of effectively and efficiently working my way around that kind of grid as it is. You know, I'm going to buy winery, or you're going to buy vineyards first because then you have a thing to build on. You're going to go to a cellar because it makes sense to increase the capacity for storing wine and also increase the value of that wine. And then it makes sense for me to go over to either getting a winery or getting some of the farmers or enologists to then kind of amplify what I already have going on there. And then at that point, it just makes sense to swing down to selling and probably exporting, because that's kind of what's next to me at that point.
And you're out of money because you just bought all those cellars and enologists and wineries and that. I do think it's important to say that we played this game at 2 and 3 players. And it's possible, not having played it at 4 players, that a lot of that control that we felt over getting things done and not necessarily feeling locked out of actions, maybe because we didn't have another player on that grid, because if you go to a space where there is another player, you'd need to pay that player. And if you go to a space where there's 2 other players, you need to pay both of them. So if you have another meeple moving around that grid, it could become a lot more costly to get the stuff you need done, because there's a greater likelihood that somebody else is on the space that you always need. That being said, we intentionally played this at 2 and 3. We looked at it and we're like, that's a big, heavy game. Maybe it doesn't need 4 people.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably a wise decision. I always felt like I was able to do what I wanted, but there was a little bit of a cost if I didn't do it in a reasonable way.
Yeah. It was very rare that I had to move onto a tile that had 2 pieces of wood, and I had to pay out $2 to get there. I think it maybe one time ever I had to go far, so I spent an extra $1, and then it was the place with the round marker and another player, so that's me being out $3. But that happening one time across a number of games, it's not really too bad, and I felt comfortable with the amount of interaction that we had on that action grid.
You mentioned how there was sort of a logical way to progress around the grid. But I do want to touch on sort of the flip side of that, which is in this game, you really need to think about not only what you're doing now, but what you want to do next. Because if you don't leave yourself in a position where there is that logical progression to move around the grid without spending a whole ton of money, you are going to cost yourself either the action that you wanted because you don't have the money to do it, or just a lot of resources to do something that you could have done significantly better if you had chosen a different order, or maybe taken another action that wouldn't necessarily get you as many points but would put you in a better position. You always need to, in this game, not only be looking at what you're doing now and what you plan to do in the future, but how you're going to move to do that, which I think is really interesting in a game that doesn't really have a board map component like so many games do when you're talking about movement. You know, you don't have the map of whatever country you're invading and you need to be able to move your troops from here to there, but there is still that movement thing that you need to be focusing on just within that little 3x3 grid.
I feel like the 2016 edition of Vinhos also really opened up that grid movement and grid action by adding in the magnate action tiles. You get to select one at the beginning of the game, and that is a really smart choice that you have to make, knowing that it's going to affect the rest of your actions throughout the game. Because, for example, I had, in this last game, very first round, I picked up a tile that was a free sell wine action. It was an action that I could sell 1 or 2 wine at whatever normal price. It was an exact duplicate of the action spot, but by taking that tile, that meant that I knew that I never had to move in that particular part of the action selection grid. So I had that option that when I needed more money, I didn't have to take a whole step to go down there and then, spend extra money to get back up to one of the top 3 row actions, because that action space is at the bottom center of the grid. So having those magnate tiles and really understanding when you're going to use them and how you're going to use them was really the thing that I found opened up the action selection of this game the most. Finding the right tile and getting it so that you could use it most effectively when you needed to make another action even more efficient was really the strength in having those side actions to me.
Yes, and because they flip up, if you've used them, you flip them face down, and they flip up only after the wine fair. and only after the first 2 wine fairs. So really, at most, you're going to be able to use those tiles 3 times, but at the same time, they give you so many more options because you're essentially adding a 14th and 15th and maybe 16th action to the game, depending on whether it's the one you take at the beginning or if you take it after the first or second wine fair. You're essentially giving yourself a whole nother thing that you get to do with each of those that provide you an action. And then if you don't take the ones that provide you an action, you're adding endgame scoring, which can be incredibly valuable as well. And then at that point, you have to really make a decision. Do I want to take that valuable endgame scoring, or do I want to give myself more options?
Speaking of options, I feel like one of the biggest things that you can focus on in this game is the actual production of wine. There's a lot of different things that you do in the game that affect the way you're going to produce your wine. You have your 5 different estates, and you're going to obviously be putting vineyards on these estates that will give you the base capacity to make wine. And then you're going to add the wineries and hopefully get the farmers and oenologists that will allow you to then increase that. So there's 3 spaces for tiles on each of your different estates. You can generally it's going to be 1 vineyard and 2 wineries, or maybe 2 vineyards that are the same region, same color, and 1 winery. And when you add the particular type of worker onto that, each of those can produce a level 3. So if you have a completely stacked estate, you're going to be producing 1 wine at a level 9. And there's other things that you can do to manipulate these. You have these cubes on each of the regions as you build in those particular regions. On the main board, you take them off to produce a higher number wine. But so much of it, to me, is affected by that weather tile at the beginning of the game. Like I said, it can swing anywhere from a -2 to a +2. So a fully maxed out estate could produce up to an 11 before you even take cubes off. But I really also found it to be one of the most frustrating parts in the game, kind of due to the weather function. Like I said earlier, the weather tile can swing from a -2 to a +2 with kind of an even distribution. You have, equal number -1s and -2s, so you do +1s and 2s. But I feel like across the six rounds of the 8 tiles, almost always at the end of the game, one of the +1s and one of the +2s were face down, and we never got to them. So we're continually running up against all these -2s, and I guess that's just from playing the game and wanting to make really fun wine that got really frustrating to me after a while.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but I did not feel that same frustration because everybody is beholden to the same weather. So I knew if I was making crappy wine this year, so were you, so was Danielle if we were playing a 3-player game. Everybody was at the same disadvantage. And while there are benefits to making better wines, I mean, you will get more points if you export or sell higher quality wines, or points or money if you export or sell higher quality wines. In the wine fair, you're all competing on equal footing. And there are enough things to do in this game with lesser quality wines. If they're sort of mediocre quality, you can sell them and still get money for them. If they're absolutely just dog meat wines, then you can use them to discard to get those magnate tiles that we were talking about being so valuable after the wine fair. And I felt like even if I had a year where I did not make quality wines, I still was able to do something. The one time it did get a little frustrating was if you had a wine that was value 0, because then you don't produce at all. But frankly, the times that happened, I could look back and be like, oh, I made a poor choice in this game. I should have purchased from a different region, maybe a region that gave me an automatic upgrade so I was at least producing a 1, or I should have taken a different action on my second turn in that particular year to somehow allow myself to produce something so that I would get a wine to discard, and maybe put into a cellar if I had a cellar, and then it would be worth more automatically.
I think that's what it was to me more than anything else, and that was something that happened in the first game that it burned me on very quickly, is that if you produce a value 0 wine, you do not produce wine. There is no 0 tile, and there's no you got a consolation 1. And in the first game, if you're not really thinking about that, and you've made a few different estates, and you've just got the base building on each of them, a -2 tile means you don't get to produce anything. And I definitely feel that would be a level that I got better at the game as we played more and more. I pretty much never let anything go below a 3 if I could help it in terms of its base production before weather, just by adding a farmer onto that particular vineyard after I build that first building. Means that at the very least it'll be a 1 tile that I can use, like you said, to get those magnate tiles.
Now, one tile that we did not play with that is, I think, an expansion tile.
Yeah, it's a Kickstarter one, yeah.
There is a tile where there is a phylloxera infestation and nobody produces any wine.
Oh, that's...
We intentionally didn't play with that. My feeling is so much about this game is preparing for what could come next. The idea that you could make no wine in a year when everything is based on, you know, preparing this so I can move it to here and then I'll have this incoming, when so much of it is based on your chain of production, I wouldn't want the opportunity to not be able to make wine in a year. Mm-hmm. That would just feel like punishment for no greater purpose. Mm-hmm. Whereas at least a -2 year, I can be like, oh, I should have been prepared for that. But I still have the chance to make something that I can then dump to get a magnate tile or whatever.
In fairness, the phylloxera tile does say, use this tile at your own risk. It is not recommended for anybody but the most advanced players. So I don't know, maybe someday down the line, we'll slip that into the deck and not tell Daniel that it's going to be in there. That would be fun to watch him freak out. Like, oh, no wine, what do we do?
One of the other things that I didn't necessarily pay attention to the first play or even the second play of this game was that when you submit a wine to the wine fair, you are judged by the 3 wine magnates, and they each want a different aspect of the wine to be a certain way. The first magnate wants it to either be a red wine or a white wine, the second magnate wants it to be of a certain value or above, and the third magnate wants it to be from a specific region. And there is certainly a strategy to just pumping a whole bunch of your resources into creating one very good estate that you can submit from every time there's a wine fair. But if you're not mindful of the fact that each of these magnates requires certain varieties of wine, you're not going to be able to get the barrels that you can take from the magnate area for satisfying whatever their requirement is. And you're not going to have those barrels to put out on the board. And this is something that changed from the 2010 to the 2016 version. You start with 2 barrels, and when you submit a wine for the wine fair, if you meet a magnate's requirement, you can take one of the barrels that you place at the beginning of the game in their section. They're going to put 2 barrels in each magnate's section, so you have a possibility of 6 additional barrels, but you can only take those barrels if you meet that magnate's qualification, and you can only take 2 per wine fair. So even if you submit a wine that meets all 3 qualifications, you're only going to get 2 additional barrels. And you need to be really careful which ones you take, because it's possible that you never meet the region qualification. If never during a wine fair year is there a region that you are submitting your wine from, you're never going to be able to get those 2 additional barrels. And those barrels are very important because in order to sell to the local market, you need to put a wine barrel out, and you only get 1 of those back at the end of every year. So if you put out 2 in a sell action, which you can do, you're only going to get 1 back. But even more importantly, you need to send those barrels permanently to the export grid when you export wine, which is a really huge getter of points. We haven't really talked about what you absolutely need to do to get points in this game, but you need to export to get winning point amounts, because you not only get the points for when you place the barrel there, you will get points at the end of the game for majority in the columns out there. So it's a huge point zone, and you need to place barrels there permanently till the end of the game. It is entirely possible, if you are not satisfying all 3 of those magnates at some point, that you're going to not have enough barrels at the end of the game, especially since those end game magnate tiles that we talked about earlier require that you place a barrel on them until the end of the game, so you're losing barrels that way as well.
Yeah, this came and kind of bit me in the butt in the last game that we played, that in the 3 wine fairs, I didn't submit a single white wine, and just so happened that the tile that came up every single wine fair was looking for a white wine, so I missed out on 2 of the barrels, which meant that I then missed out on getting some more export points and probably getting another multiplier tile at the end of the game. So it is the kind of thing that you need to really plan out which ones you're going to be submitting based on those qualifications, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself without some barrels. And that's, probably a good 10, 20 points that you can be getting away with 2 extra barrels.
The ones I always found the hardest to do were the region ones because, if you're submitting a wine from a specific region, they want 4 of the 9 different regions. So it's a little less than 50-50 that you're going to be submitting from one of those regions.
Yeah.
Whereas with the red or white, it's either red or it's white. So that's a 50-50 chance. And with the value, I never really felt like the value was so high that I wasn't able to meet it, especially if I had a couple of reputation cubes on my region.
Yeah.
But the location one was the one that I always felt like if I can get that, I need to take that barrel early in the game.
Yeah, that's definitely a smart one to jump on for sure. I want to go back and look at the weather tiles and see how balanced the regions are, because I felt like they all have 1 on them, or at least they almost always have region 1 on them, which is interesting because that's one that I always go to. It's the one that gives you plus 2 points in the fair when you submit that particular wine, and it's the one that I always end up submitting to the wine, so it's worked out really well for me. But I wonder what the balance is on those to see if they are evenly balanced across the 8 tiles that you'll use in the game. I don't think that they could be, I guess.
I would venture they wouldn't be, because there are definitely some regions that are more powerful when you look at their individual power. I know almost every game that we've played, one of the initial vineyards that somebody takes is from Lisboa, which gives you a free winery at the beginning of the game.
Yeah,
so you're
really
automatically producing at least a 3, but you have the potential with very little additional work to be producing at least a 5, possibly a 6 if you get a farmer as well.
Yeah.
And the enologist and farmer are hired from the same space, so it would be very easy to just go to one space and be producing at a 6. So it's probably less likely that those will meet the region qualification, whereas things that may not be as initially powerful would be on more of those wine magnate tiles, because that would balance the game a little better.
I want to talk a little bit about scaling in this game, but I think I want to bridge it over by talking about the export area that we haven't really discussed a whole lot so far. So this export area, in a 3 or 4 player game, it's 5 columns of 4 rows, and it's kind of a cascading number, and depending on what value wine you submit, you get to put a barrel on one of a number that is equal to or lesser than the wine you're submitting. So I think they start at like a 5 and go up to like a 12 or something in the other corner. And then depending on majorities that you have in each of the different columns, you get additional endgame points. So you get points for placing the barrel for whatever number you place it on. And then if you have the majority in a specific column, you get additional endgame points. And interestingly, the low value column of, the 5, 6, 7, 8 value wines is the one that has the highest endgame points. This is kind of a remanipulation of the 2010 system that had kind of like a grid kind of mechanic as well, where I guess like the horizontal row was the now points and the vertical row was the then points. But in a 2-player game, the 4x5 export grid shrinks down to a 3x3 grid, which really makes it a totally different game there. Because in a 3 or 4 player game, majority is going to be generally 2 barrels. 3 barrels will lock it in, but if 2 players have 2 barrels each in a particular column, they split the points. In a 3 player game, it's pretty unlikely you're going to be splitting points in any row, and since it's the points for 10, 12 and 8 points, I think, for endgame points there, getting two barrels in one of those columns is a huge swing in points, and the other players really got to come back and claim the other 2 rows if you want to have any other chance.
The other thing that I feel like was really important in a 2-player game that you could possibly have played differently in a 3 or 4-player game was the wine fair. In a 3-player game, or I assume in a 4-player game, you can maybe sit back around on the wine fair and maybe not produce the strongest wine in order to make sure that you are satisfying the magnates that you want to satisfy. Because if you come in second, there is a slight drop in points, but it's not the end of the world. I mean, I think it's like 3 points the first round, 4 points the second round, 5 points the third wine fair. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a 2-player game, you only use the first and third place scoring. So you start with a 6-point difference in points, and then it goes up to all the way to a 10-point difference in points in the final wine fair. And because that track doesn't reset, if you're not constantly trying to produce the absolute best wine you possibly can as far as value goes, then you're going to miss out on a lot of points. And I feel like it's much more vital that you focus on the wine fair in a 2-player game. We've seen somebody come in 2nd place out of 3, absolutely phoning in the wine fair in a 3-player game. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a 2-player game, if you are not pushing that, you're going to be down 20 points by the end of the game, just from that particular aspect.
I also felt in a 2-player game, I was paying way more attention to what you had going on in your board. In a 3-player game, I can kind of focus on building my engine and kind of just be aware of what regions other players are going into. But in the 2-player game, like you said, with the wine fair, I was very, very aware of what wines you had the capability of producing, because I knew not only would I be fighting you in the wine fair, but I would also be fighting you in that export track. There's only, 9 spots to go around there, and if you produce the spot that's the lowest one that I could possibly take, then I need to come up with another way to get some points on that particular barrel before I send it anywhere. Otherwise, I'm just going to have a barrel and nothing to do with it.
Well, I feel like that also has to do with the fact that the 5 space, the 2 6 spaces, and 2 of the 7 spaces on the export track are removed in a 2-player game, because in a 3-player game, you don't rely on those reputation cubes to bump up the value of your game. In a 3-player game, you don't rely on those reputation cubes to bump up the value of your wine to be able to export it as much as you would in a 2-player game, where those wines need to be of a greater value in order to even reach that export board.
Do you have a player count that you would like to play this at, particularly?
I think I'd like to play it at 3. While 2 worked fine, it wasn't like a mechanical problem. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed a little bit more freedom that you get from having a 3-player game, which is weird to say that by adding a player you gain more freedom, but I certainly felt that way.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think I like that as well, just because it allows you to have more turnover in the player order track. In a 2-player game, I think maybe the very last action you went first instead of me, and that's just because that's the way that the fair particularly worked out. In a 3-player game, we're changing pretty much every round what the player order is going to be. And that's just always an interesting dynamic in any kind of game like this, knowing what kind of strategies another player is going towards and then having to adapt, knowing that they're going to be getting to a space before you. So talking about replayability on this, I feel like in the base game, you have a good bit of replayability in that you're continuing to learn how to be more and more efficient with your stuff. There's also some variable setup in a 2 or 3-player game. You remove 1 or 2 of the regions from the board, so instead of 9 you have 8 or 7 depending on player count, and you can randomly select that to kind of give you a different what kind of options you have for you to build your vineyard. So that's some variability.
I do feel like there are certain things that you need to get done, at least in the first age, I want to call it an age, before the first wine fair, in order to be at least competitive in that wine fair and to be able to get some of those export barrels out where you need them to be. I do feel like there's a certain group of things, but you need to be mindful of where the other players are at the same time. So there's a little bit of variability in the order you take those actions, but you are going to be doing a lot of the same things in the same time zone in every game. I'm never going to be exporting on my first turn because I have just a garbage wine that I made from my free vineyard. But I'm going to be exporting a lot in turns 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah.
Or I guess years 5, 6, and the 13th turn at the end. Mm-hmm. It's going to feel similar, but I feel like making the small tweaks to have a better game are what makes this interesting. There is also going to be some variability in those magnate tiles to decide, what is going to be worth scoring at the end of the game, what you'll get extra points for. That will change the way you play the end of your game.
There's also obviously some variability in that the 2010 edition of the game is playable through here. I don't honestly think that that's replayability that I particularly want. The 2010 edition had some, well, let's just say complications versus the 2016, or I guess rather the 2016 streamlined a lot of stuff. Most notably the bank in the 2010 edition, which we haven't talked about at all.
Because it's not in the 2016 edition.
So in the 2010 edition of the game, instead of just having the option to go sell, you do have that option, but to sell and then immediately get money is not really a kind of thing you have, because you have this bank that will manage all of your money for you, and you have to specifically go to the bank space to withdraw money from the bank. And then that entire thing also operates with kind of an investment system where you can invest money, you can divest money, and then generate more and more income. But having to go to the bank to do an action of getting money is an extra wrinkle that I just really don't want to play with a whole lot. That's a lot, especially in a 12 action game.
It certainly did make it seem a little bit more fiddly, because you needed to plan how much money you were going to need for everything that you were going to do until you were able to spend another of your actions going back to the bank. And while the 2016 edition still requires you to have enough money to be able to do all the things, so there is a certain amount of financial planning that you're doing, you don't necessarily need to do all of it maybe 3 years ahead of when you're going to need it, because you don't want to waste an action to go back to the bank. The other thing that is a major change in the 2016 edition from the 2010 edition is the magnate section. In the 2010 edition, the magnate section is fixed, and each of the magnates has a certain set of actions that they allow you to do if you discard a wine to move your barrel from their section to the right side of their board. And they never change, so you don't have that variability that I was just talking about in those magnate tiles, where certain things may be coming out at different points in the game and may change the way you're able to score points at the end or take additional actions later in the game. They are just fixed, and each one is based on where you've placed the barrel on the red and white magnate, on the value magnate, or on the region magnate. I certainly think both of those main changes are improvements in the 2016 version versus the 2010 version.
And there's one other very significant change that happened between the 2010 and the 2016 editions, and that is all revolving around the wine fair.
Oh yeah, I had completely forgotten about that.
And I understand why, because oh boy, was that 2010 wine fair quite complicated. So the way that it works there is that depending on the value of the wine that you've created, you have the opportunity to use a specific number of wine expert tiles to score points and also manipulate the values of the 4 different features of wine on their own individual tracks. And then depending on the stuff that you submitted, you can then move yourself around the wine fair track a specific way that will then also get you points. I'm going to just leave it at that, because we played it and I still don't really understand how I was supposed to do that effectively.
Now, we talked about how this was a big and dense box.
Mm-hmm.
Value-wise, we're talking about an MSRP of $100, but realistically, you can find this for about $65, as low as $65 online. Yeah. That's without all the Kickstarter expansion stuff that we said that we had, but I think almost everything that we've described in the game that we're playing isn't Kickstarter stuff. We didn't play with a lot of the Kickstarter stuff because you can't get it.
Yeah.
What would be the point of telling you how cool that stuff is? Yeah,
pretty much everything we talked about is in the base box of the game. The Kickstarter adds in the tourism and, I guess, extended wine cellars, extended vineyards, double wide vineyards, and double wide wineries, and you have 2 additional islands, and you have this whole wooden winery kind of buildings that just look cool. And then the phylloxera tile that shall not be used ever. So, I mean, there's a good bit of stuff to get in terms of enhancements to this game. I know that Eagle Griffin has them available from time to time. I think I've seen them at conventions, that kind of stuff. They have upgrade packs available. But for $65 to $75, if you go online, or you get a lot of game out of this box. And it's really well produced. I can definitely see the value if you like this kind of game, if you like that heavy, small number of actions, lots of interactivity between your actions, and efficiency puzzle. So what are your final thoughts here about Vinhos?
Vinhos is obviously not going to be an every week game. None of these high gravity reviews are going to be every week games because they are just so big and thought requiring. I have a feeling this is going to be the type of game where I'm going to want to come back to it once, maybe twice a year, and enjoy the efficiency puzzle that it is, because that's what it really is. It's an efficiency puzzle. You have only 13 turns. how can you do the best with a limited set of actions. The game is simple enough to sit down at that I don't feel like I'm going to completely lose the rule set between plays if I wait 6 months between plays. But it is also really pretty, so it is enjoyable to sit down at, especially if you haven't, sat down at this particular game in a while. I feel like it's going to be a great 1 or 2 time a year game.
Vinhos is a really thought-provoking and elegant puzzle of efficiency. And coming into this game, I didn't really understand how much I could get done in a game that only allows me to have 12 actions. Well, 13 actions, I guess, technically. But there's so much more depth you can earn from the additional actions with magnate tiles and wine experts that 13 actions and 6 rounds of the game really produces a whole lot of game. That's gotten me to the point where I'm thinking about efficiency and I'm thinking about the next play. I definitely agree I'm not going to be playing this every month or, more than a few times a year, but I feel like it's the kind of game I want to come back to and have in that rotation, and I like having these heavy games for that reason, that it gives you opportunities to really think about, well, what could I do if I just had one more action in this game? And that's kind of the strength of Vinhos. It says, well, you know what? If you plan better, maybe you can have one more action. All right, well, that's it for the review of Vinhos. Again, thanks to Eagle Gryphon Games for the review copy on that one. And we'll be taking a quick break to come back and put Vinhos on tap. For more information on the beers we chose to pair with today's game on tap, check out the show notes section at our website, draftmechanic.net.
So when I was looking to do an on-tap for Vinhos, I realized I couldn't just do beer that had sort of a wine bent to it, because we did that in episode 19 all the way back many years ago when we did viticulture on tap. But there is still a market in the on-tap world for Vinhos, and we've got 4 delicious sounding brews right here that we want to tell you about if you want to somehow take part of your brain that is busy trying to figure out what to do in 13 actions and give it some adult beverages to work on, too.
Yes. All right, first up from Sierra Nevada Brewing Company in Chico, California, and also Mills River, North Carolina, we have the Estate Homegrown IPA. This IPA clocks in at 6.7% ABV and 67 IBU. This is rich with the flavors of the valley. It's featuring hops with earthy, grapefruit-like flavors and layered spicy aromas, and barley with mild sweetness and smooth, toasted flavors. This is released in bombers. It's usually yearly at this point. I know that the 2017 edition came out in the fall, so hopefully we'll be seeing this one again in the next few months with a new, fresh estate crop of stuff.
Next up from Argus Cidery in Austin, Texas, we have Vinho Perda. This is a Perry cider, and it is 6.8% ABV. It is a lagered Perry with green apple notes and a tart citrus finish. It is bottled in 12-ounce bottles, but I've also seen pictures of 750 milliliter bottles. Ooh. I think they've moved to the 12-ounce bottle from that, though.
Gotcha. Argus does some good stuff.
Argus does some very good stuff. It's not your traditional, really overly one-note and sweet cider that you might get from some of the larger brand ciders. This is more one of those cool craft ciders that we talk about from time to time around here.
Cool crafts. Third, we have Oddside Ales in Grand Haven, Michigan, with Vinho Tinto. This is an Imperial Red Ale, 11% ABV, and it is an Imperial Red Ale aged in ruby red port barrels. That sounds really good. It's available on draft in Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Indiana.
This is one of those selections that seems to pop up at one bar in that region, and then it'll show up maybe a week later at another bar in that region. So really, if you are in the Midwest, just keep an eye out for this. It sounds really delicious, and it is sparsely available, but still pretty consistently available, just looking at check-ins on it.
Stealth beer.
On the flip side of that, things that are currently and probably only for a short time available, we have from Trillium Brewing Company a collaboration with Monkish. Trillium is out of Canton, Massachusetts. We have Eno beer. That is spelled OENOBIER, for those of you who need to type that into anything. This is an American wild ale that comes in at 9.3% ABV. It is a wild beer aged on muscat grape juice. It has a hazy straw to golden orange hue and delivers wafts of light farmhouse funk. Notes of muscat, must, and lemon grace the palate, while its crisp, effervescent finish is a delicate delight. I really love their copy. It's reminiscent of champagne, and this is bottled. It is available right now. There were 544 logins on Untappd when I pulled this one, and they were all in the last month. So if you are looking for this, it is available at Trillium right now. It just released a week or two ago. Go get it, because first of all, Trillium is amazing. Second of all, Monkish is amazing. And third of all, wine beers are amazing. So go get this now if you are in Massachusetts.
And if you are looking for information on any of these beers, of course, they will be on the show notes section on draftmechanic.net. Danielle, you're on quite a tear with beer primers recently, and it seems like hefeweizens are your latest target.
Well, it's actually not a target that I picked. After the Sours beer primer that we did last episode, which we had pulled from the Slack channel, there was a little bit of rumbling in our Slack channel in the beer section saying, well, can you do hefeweizens next? And honestly, I really thought I had done them already, but obviously I had not, because this is a really cool story that I'm about to tell you, and I would have remembered if I had ever done so. So thank you to our Slack channel for setting me straight and reminding me that I had not done a hefeweizens beer primer.
All right, I'm leaning in for story time.
So wheat beers are some of the first beers that were crafted because harvested wheat would get wet, and there is ambient yeast in the air everywhere. So like we talked about with the lambics, there was just sort of natural fermentation on this wet wheat water. And then people were like, oh, we should drink that, which I do not understand. But I guess there was not a whole lot to do in the Fertile Crescent in like really early agricultural times. So people were drinking wheat beer for a very, very long time. But brewers eventually moved towards barley to leave the wheat for food production because people need to eat as well. Well, when the Reinheitsgebot, which is the German brewing purity law, went into effect in Germany in 1516, wheat beer was essentially outlawed because the Reinheitsgebot only allows you to put hops, barley, and water into beer because we hadn't discovered what yeast was yet. We were just drinking wet wheat water. And so until yeast was discovered to have a process in the making of beer, it wasn't included in Reinheitsgebot. But wheat definitely wasn't. Wheat is a no. See, there's a problem with that, though, because the rulers in Bavaria, which is where this law is going into effect, were really fond of wheat beer, particularly the Duke of Wittelsbach. And he really liked the Weissbier, which is what they called wheat beer at the time, because it was lighter than the other beers that were being brewed. It was white beer, so they called it Weissbier. And he didn't want to give up a thing he liked because he's a person that's in charge, and people that are in charge don't like giving up stuff that they like, even if they've just made the rules that make it not allowed. So he, in 1520, mandated that one brewery in Schwarzach, owned by the Dukes of Dugenberg, could continue to produce Weissbier. You know, they paid a very nice fee to be able to do that, and they provided the Weissbier for the Duke of Wittelsbach, and he got to have what he wanted, and they got to make money for making this beer, and everybody, I guess, was happy. This worked fine until 1602, when the last Duke of Dugenberg died and he didn't have an heir.
Oh, no.
So nobody is in control of this brewery anymore.
Who's going to sell all the wet wheat beer?
Well, good news is we have feudal law for things like this. When you die and you don't have an heir under feudal law, your brewery gets returned to the rulers of the area, who are, unsurprisingly, the Wittelsbachs from back in 1516, who liked the wet wheat beer.
Hang on.
They were the rulers of the overarching area. They were the leaders of Bavaria. So when this guy died and he had no son, they were like, yoink, we're going to take that thing that we like. And now we're in charge of it.
Incredibly convenient.
Nowhere did I find anything that said that he died under mysterious circumstances, so...
Crushed under the weight of wet wheat.
Perhaps. So now the Duke of Wittelsbach is in charge of the Weissbier brewery, and he decides that if one Weissbier brewery is great, we should make a lot of them, and we'll own all of them. And we'll set them up all across Bavaria, including in Munich, next to his other brewery, which he already owned, which would later become something you might have heard of, the Hofbrauhaus Munich.
Oh.
If you remember from our Oktoberfest episode where we talked about that, Hofbrauhaus Munich, kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal.
So he sets up this Weissbier brewery right next to it. And things are going great. All the people in Bavaria want to drink what the rulers want to drink, so Weissbier is very popular. And it continues being very popular for a while. Until advances in brewing technology and changes in taste cause public opinion to move away from Weissbier and towards the other German lager styles. At which point, it stops being really profitable to own a bunch of Weissbier breweries for the Duke of Wittelsbach. And he, in 1855, or possibly 1856, depending on which source you are willing to believe, sells off his main Weissbier brewery, the one next to the Hofbrauhaus, to George Schneider.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
George Schneider buys this and starts brewing it with his family and continues brewing it for, 100 years when it's not super popular. Mm-hmm. Weissbier didn't come back into public favor until the mid-1900s, and when it came back into fashion, George Schneider and Son was the most popular Weissbier brewer and is still around today.
Yes.
In fact, if I were to tell you modern examples of Weissbier that you could, if you were looking for a Hefeweizen, because a Hefeweizen is the type of Weissbier, we'll get to that in a minute, Schneiderweisse and Weinstefeiner Hefeweizenbier are the two, shining examples that I would say to you, go out and find. These are really just classic German breweries that are creating a delicious beer. Like I said, a Hefeweizen, which is what we're supposed to be talking about, right? This is a beer primer on Hefeweizens, is one of the 4 types of Weissbier. Hefeweizen is the unfiltered wheat beer, and it is by far the most popular. There's also something called a Crystalweizen, which is the filtered version of it. The Hefeweizen literally means yeast wheat, which is a great name for anything, right? Because you can see the cloudiness in it from the yeast that is not filtered out of it. The Crystalweizen is crystal clear, like Crystal Pepsi, I guess, because the yeast is filtered out of it. There is also a Weizenbock, which we talked about briefly in our box episode, which is a stronger version of a wheat beer, usually brewed in the winter. And there is a Dunkelweizen, which is a wheat beer that is brewed with darker malts. The Dunkel is dark in German. That is a darker color than the sort of straw color that you'll get from Hefeweizen, unsurprisingly, from all that wheat in it. Hefeweizen is usually between 50 and 70% wheat in the grain bill, and it has a cloudy appearance and a thick white head at the top. It has prominent flavors and aromas of banana and clove, and obviously wheat. But it also has vanilla and fruity gum flavors, which sounds dumb, but I found that mentioned in a bunch of places. It was often described as juicy fruit gum, which I feel like is a little bit on the nose, but there was listing as bubble gum or fruit gum, and that is one of the mostly aromas that you're going to get from this type of beer. It should have a very low hop presence. It was said in one of the sources I was looking at that it was even half of that of a low hop presence beer. So you're talking about a very low hop flavor. And the alcohol should be around 5%, because if you get much stronger than that, then you're talking about a Weizenbock, because the difference between a Weizenbock and a Hefeweizen is that one is stronger than the other. So you want to keep that ABV kind of low. That also helps because these are really popular in the summer. People go out and they don't want a high ABV beer to be drinking in the sun. So this is one of those nice, it's got that banana flavor to it and that sort of the fruit flavor that goes well with warm weather. And this is a good beer to have because it is low in alcohol. I had suggested to you the Schneiderweiss, which we now know is the first non-Wittelsbach after the Reinheitsgebot Hefeweizen. And there are tons of breweries all across Europe and all across America and probably all across everywhere where beer is made that are now making Hefeweizens. They have just exploded in popularity since the 1950s. If you have any kind of brewing scene near you, I would be very surprised if you couldn't find a Hefeweizen that was being brewed near you, which is a great thing. I'm glad it survived a law that was making it completely just not legal to make, and then like so many other different kinds of really interesting beer we've seen that are popular now, just complete dips in popularity. This is a great beer to try, especially if you're not an avid beer drinker, because it's not necessarily really hoppy and it doesn't have that really beery flavor that a lot of people associate with like a Pilsner or something like that. If you're not a huge beer person, or you know somebody who's not a huge beer person, this might be something they like if they like that nice banana-y flavor to it. Hefeweizens.
Hefeweizens. I did not know that about the Schneiderson Brewery, which is one of my favorite German breweries, because they do produce one of my favorite beers of all time, Aventinus.
It's true.
Yes. All right. Well, that's some cool stuff. One more break? One more final round?
One more final round.
Well, I mean, just, for this episode.
Yeah.
You can only have one final round per episode. That's the law.
That's how final rounds work. This is not Final Fantasy.
No.
Consumption of draftmechanic.net impairs your ability to drive a car or operate heavy machinery. Because it's a website, guys. Don't go on the internet while you're driving.
Alrighty, it is time for the final round. In the final round discussion, every episode we ask our Slack channel about a specific topic. If you would like to join in and chime in and put your voice on as well, draftmechanic.net/Slack is where you go to sign up for free. Danielle, this is your topic this episode, and your topic is, and I quote, "When it comes to pointing out options for other players in competitive games, how likely are you to pipe up? What styles of games or play environments make you more or less likely to lend a helping hand?"
And I wanted to ask this question because we had two scenarios come up in the same week that were really different, but had to do with the same topic, and I wanted everybody else's opinion on it. We had one game where we were playing a game of Las Vegas with, I think, 5 or 6 players. And one of the players, every time she rolled her dice, it seemed like everybody at the table was like, oh, you could do this or you could do that. And nobody was actually trying to tell her what to do. It was just, I don't know if it was where she was sitting at the table or just what was going on. Maybe that everybody could see her dice. Everybody was suggesting what she could do. And it got to the point where she was just like, you know what, guys, I can figure out what I want to do by myself. Because she was very obviously capable of doing that. And nobody was trying to control what she was doing. We were just, chit-chatting because it's a light game and there's not a lot to do between your turns. And that was leading to her being given all these options that she already knew. Later that week, we were playing a game of Vinhos, and in the very last wine fair, there was one of the endgame scoring tiles that would have been better for, I think it was you, than initially it seemed. And right before you were about to take the one that was not as good for you, I was like, oh, that one's probably better because of this, this, and this. And you were like, oh, yeah, that's right. And then you took it, and that we just went on with the game, and it was no big deal. And those two situations were in just such stark comparison as to the way they affected the player who was given the suggestion that I wanted to know what other people's opinions were. So our first answer comes from BJ from Board Game Gumbo. He says, "This issue came up in a recent scout trip out west. I taught Jiraku to a bunch of scouts. My son and I would help out with strategy for the first round, but gave less and less help during the second and third rounds. One of the joys in gaming is discovering some strategies on your own. That being said, my favorite game of Lisboa was when me and a friend played an open game where we talked through our strategy as we played. It's a deeper game than we're used to, so hearing what the other player thinks was very helpful in figuring out why of the game." Mm-hmm. And I think this sort of touches on what I was talking about when we were playing Vinhos. That's a deeper game, and it's helpful to have other players' just vantage point so that you can make the right move because there's so few things that you're doing. You want to make sure all of them are done right.
Yeah, it actually comes to mind in our 2-player game. We actually started just talking openly about, all right, well, I have this wine value, and this is what I'm most likely going to submit to the wine fair, because there's so many different pieces going there that to hide or obfuscate that kind of information can kind of be a pain and kind of, damage the whole play experience.
At the same time, in that 2-player game, I know there was a point where I had flat out said to you, like, you can look at my board. This is very clearly what I'm going to submit.
Yeah.
And you had miscalculated what my value of my wine would be. I didn't correct you on that. Mm-hmm. You had miscalculated something that was very obvious to you if you had looked at it again. But if you had done something that would have taken you on like a wildly different bent from what I was planning on doing, I probably would have pointed it out. but I'm not gonna play your game for you, and you wouldn't do the same for me. But at the same time, it's in a deeper game like that, it's sort of satisfying to play against a good game that the other person is playing.
Yeah. So some thoughts from Will Foy. Will says, I play cribbage every week semi-competitively, but we also welcome new players who just want to have fun. So the object is play to win, but not be a jerk. The line for me on suggesting things usually involves tournament play. For instance, when I played in an official American Cribbage Congress event last year, my opponents didn't make suggestions to me, or I to them, but we ended honorably on a handshake and I did get feedback to improve my own game. But after matches. If I'm playing a game of any kind casually outside of formal competition, and the player might either seek it or might need the help, I don't mind suggesting it. If the player is trying to do things on their own, I'm fine with a tall glass of, quote, shut the heck up and play my own game, unquote. I firmly believe in a principle from TAC's tournament culture and something my own cribbage club inculcates. I want my best game to beat your best game. If that means pulling back a move to make a better one, or fixing a simple issue, or grabbing points retroactively, etc., I'd much rather do that and still win, hopefully, but not be a jerk. I'd much rather lose to someone who will want to play with me again than beat them because I was a jerk. Sometimes that means being helpful and losing, and I'm okay with that. I like that philosophy. It's fun to discuss those things in those kind of games where, oh, hey, by the way, this wasn't calculated correctly. Let me help you out on that. And not just wait for the other player to hopefully see it and try to pull one over on them. That's not really fun in games.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that idea that I want my best game to beat your best game, especially in a game that is heavier, that maybe takes a little bit longer, where you're investing 2, 3, 4 hours in a game. You don't want to win, or at least I wouldn't want to win or lose just because I didn't see something small and stupid. Whereas, like in a lighter game, okay, if you're only investing half an hour in something, it doesn't really matter if you lose because you screwed up something. It doesn't necessarily show a huge lack of your strategy the same way, just losing because you made one wrong move in a heavy game can just tear apart a strategy. Ryan Quick actually commented on what Will said. He said, I'm with Will. Most of the time I've got folks who are there for the social aspect primarily. And me personally, I prefer historical or co-op anyway, where I can learn something or work as a group, so I tend to offer up suggestions a lot. I think the key is around ensuring that games are fun. I look at it like this. If there's a place for spectators to watch, then you're involved in something where the fun, for most folks, is delivered directly from the competition itself. When you're around a table with friends, especially friends you want to keep after that game night, then the fun derives from camaraderie first and the game second, so help them out. When everyone gets good enough to be competitive, the help will naturally curtail, and the fun will come from the play. Except Smash Up and Munchkin, of course. All bets are off with those two.
Yeah, that does really bring up a good point. There are some games that very specifically do not want any kind of help, just by their nature. It's very combative kind of games like that really kind of draw that out.
Yeah, and I think that's what was happening in that first situation that I described at the beginning of the final round, where everybody was giving one player suggestions, but in a game like Las Vegas, it's really all about trying to snipe stuff from the other players. So the advice really comes with a grain of salt anyway. I mean, you're going to want to take the points from anybody who's giving you advice sort of at the last second anyway. So that sort of falls into that Munchkin Smash Up category where it's all about take that and stealing something at the last minute. Whereas, if you're all trying to learn a game together, it's so much better to just give somebody a little suggestion if they maybe aren't comfortable yet. And he's right. Eventually, if you get used to a game, you're not going to miss those things, so you won't need advice from other players.
Good words. I dig it. Well, this brings us to the end of another episode of Draft Mechanic. As always, you can find us on the internet at draftmechanic.net and at Draft Mechanic on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the usual social media places.
We've got a Board Game Geek Guild. That is guild number 2470. So if you want to go over there, there will be a thread up for this episode. Let us know what you think.
If you desperately need to email us, draftmechanic@gmail.com is the best way to do it. And of course, you can always get directly and talk to us at draftmechanic.net/Slack. Sign up for our Slack channel and be a part of the final round.
Our next game night in the Charlotte area is going to be on Tuesday, June 19th at Salud Cerveceria. That is tomorrow night if you're listening to this day of release.
Mm-hmm. And again, we do have the great big board game day coming up Sunday, August 12th at Good Road Cider Works in Charlotte. Please hit up our Facebook page and RSVP to that if you are interested in coming. I just really would like to get a head count on this thing. I have a few interesting ideas planned for it that will make it more than your ordinary game night.
Draft Mechanic is sponsored by Grey Fox Games. Visit greyfoxgames.com and sign up for their newsletter for the latest. Grey Fox Games, quality games, cleverly crafted.
And finally, I do implore all of you, please go check out punchboardmedia.com to look at all of the other content creators that are part of the Punchboard Media Network. There are definitely going to be a lot of takes of the stuff from Origins, and I highly encourage you to go check out some of that cool stuff. I'm pretty sure I've covered everything. Danielle, do you have anything else you wanted to throw in here?
As always, I would like to remind our listeners to please game responsibly and tell them that I'll see them back here in 2 weeks for another round.
Alrighty. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Draft Mechanic episode 77 was recorded on Saturday, June 16th, 2018 in front of a live and very rambunctious Studio Cat.
Beauty is in your eyes, you are the beholder. You render me stricken. Do not go gently into that gutter line.
Hi, this is Eric Buscemi, popping in to let you know about a continuing interview series I've been doing on the Punchboard Media website called In Focus, Perspectives in Board Gaming. I've been interviewing people that work in all different facets of the board game industry, such as designers Nikki Valens and Danielle Salas, artists Fernandez Suarez and Beth Sobel, board game publishers Anne-Marie DeWitt and Shari Spiro, and many other people with unique industry perspectives. Check out our interviews on the Punchboard Media website, www.punchboardmedia.com, where a new one is posted every Wednesday afternoon.
Punchboard Media,
where we all
bring something
to the table.
Pull up a chair
at punchboardmedia.com.